I never imagined that opening that door would change my life forever. The snowstorm raged outside, and I was alone, as always, in that isolated mountain cabin. But then I heard the knocks, strong, urgent, as if the wind wasn't the only thing fighting against the cold. When I opened the door, he was there, tall, strong, his brown hair covered in snow and his lips trembling from the freezing air. He needed help. I needed something I didn't even realize. That night started with a warm fireplace and 2 cups of tea, but it ended in a blaze that not even the harshest winter could extinguish. The snowstorm had been relentless all day. The wind howled like a wounded beast, rattling the wooden shutters of my secluded mountain cabin. I sat by the fire, a cup of steaming tea in my hands, trying to enjoy the warmth that contrasted with the icy chaos outside. Living here was a choice I made years ago, trading the noise and demands of the city for solitude and simplicity. But with every passing winter, the silence felt heavier, a weight pressing on my chest. Loneliness was my only companion in these mountains. It was a night like any other, until I heard it. A knock at the door, firm and persistent, cutting through the wind's wail. My heart raced, startled by the unexpected sound. Who could possibly be out in a storm like this? Grabbing a lantern, I hesitated for a moment, staring at the door. My nearest neighbor was miles away, and no one ever ventured this deep into the wilderness without a purpose. The knocks came again, louder this time. I took a breath and pulled the door open. There he stood, a towering figure, his broad shoulders dusted with snow. His brown hair was wet and stuck to his forehead, and his cheeks were red from the cold. He looked like he had emerged from a survival film, except this was real. His lips were slightly parted, trembling as he breathed heavily, his eyes wide with desperation. "Please," he said, his voice hoarse. I had an accident. My car slid off the road and I couldn't find anyone nearby. I saw your light. I need help." I blinked, taking in the sight of him. He was young, probably in his early 30s, and despite the cold, his presence exuded a rugged warmth. Without thinking twice, I stepped aside. "Come in, quickly." He didn't need to be told twice. The man stepped in, shaking the snow off his coat as I closed the door behind him. The wind roared, as if angry that it had lost its prey. I turned to face him, and for the first time, I noticed how exhausted he looked. His hands were stiff, his clothes damp, and his boots caked in snow. "Sit by the fire," I said, gesturing to the chair closest to the hearth. "I'll get you something warm to drink." "Thank you," he muttered, his voice still shaky. He dropped his bag near the chair and held his hands out to the flames, visibly relieved to feel the warmth. I moved quickly, pouring another cup of tea and bringing it over to him. As he sipped it, color slowly returned to his face. "Are you hurt?" I asked, crouching near him. "No," he said, shaking his head. "Just cold. And lucky I found your place. I didn't think I'd make it." His voice carried a slight rasp, as if he'd been shouting for help earlier. "What happened?" I pressed, curious about how he'd ended up here. My cabin was far off any main roads, and I rarely saw strangers. "My car skidded on the ice," he explained. "I lost control and ended up in a ditch. The engine died, and I couldn't stay there. It was freezing. I started walking, hoping to find someone, anyone, and then I saw the light from your window. It was like a miracle." A miracle. That word lingered in my mind as I studied him. He was striking, even in his disheveled state. His strong jawline, the faint stubble on his face, and the intensity of his brown eyes, everything about him seemed almost out of place in my simple mountain life. "I'm James," I said, extending a hand. "And you're lucky to be alive, honestly." He took my hand, his grip firm but cold. "Elliot," he replied. "And yeah, I'm lucky. If it weren't for you, I don't know what would have happened." For a moment, we just looked at each other, the crackling fire filling the silence. There was something in his gaze, a mixture of gratitude and curiosity, that made my chest tighten. I cleared my throat and stood up, breaking the moment. "You'll need to stay here tonight," I said. "The storm's only getting worse, and there's no way anyone's driving in this." Elliot nodded, his expression softening. "I didn't expect you to say no, but thank you. Really, I'll sleep wherever you have space." "You can take the couch," I offered. "It's comfortable enough." As I gathered extra blankets and pillows, I couldn't shake the strange energy in the room. It wasn't just the storm outside or the fact that I had a stranger in my home. It was him. There was something magnetic about Elliot, something I hadn't felt in years. My solitary life rarely brought anyone new into my world, and now, here he was. A man who seemed to carry as much weight in his eyes as I did in my heart. By the time I returned to the living room, Elliot had taken off his wet coat and boots, revealing a lean, muscular frame beneath his sweater. He looked up at me, smiling faintly. "Feels good to finally be warm again." I swallowed hard, nodding. "Good. You'll need your strength. Storms like this can last for days." "Days, huh?" He leaned back, stretching his arms behind his head. "Guess I'll get comfortable then." His tone was playful, but his smile was genuine. For the first time in years, I felt something stir inside me. Hope, or maybe something deeper. The storm raged on, but inside the cabin, the air was starting to warm in more ways than one. The hours ticked by as the storm outside raged on, its ferocity showing no signs of waning. Inside, the cabin was a world of its own, a cocoon of warmth, light, and something I hadn't felt in a long time: connection. Elliot sat across from me, nursing his second cup of tea, his cheeks no longer pale from the cold, but flushed with the comfort of the fire. His presence filled the room, not just physically, but emotionally, breaking through the loneliness that had been my constant companion for years. "So," Elliot said, leaning forward, his hands wrapped around the warm mug, "do you always live this far off the grid? No neighbors, no family, no anyone?" I shrugged, glancing at the fire as I poked at it with the iron poker. "I like the quiet. Or at least, I thought I did when I moved here. It's peaceful, you know? No drama, no noise, just the sound of the wind and the birds. But after a while, the silence gets too loud," he finished for me, his voice soft but knowing. I looked up, surprised at how easily he understood. "Exactly?" Elliot smiled faintly, setting his mug down. "I get it. I'm not exactly a social butterfly myself. After my divorce, I started spending a lot more time alone. Thought it would be better that way. Easier. Turns out I was wrong." "Divorce?" I asked, surprised by how much that one word seemed to weigh on him. He nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, married for 5 years. It ended about 6 months ago. We just wanted different things. Or at least, that's what we told ourselves. I think, deep down, I knew it was over long before it actually was." There was a sadness in his eyes that mirrored my own. For years, I had convinced myself that solitude was a choice, that I didn't need anyone else to be happy. But hearing Elliot's story made me realize how much I had been avoiding: the vulnerability of connection, the fear of loss, and, most of all, the possibility of finding something real. "Sorry to hear that," I said quietly, not knowing what else to say. Elliot shrugged, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "Don't be." In some ways, it was a blessing. It forced me to figure out who I am and what I really want. Still working on that last part, though. The way he looked at me when he said those words made my pulse quicken. There was an unspoken tension between us, a current that neither of us had acknowledged but both seemed to feel. I busied myself by stoking the fire again, trying to steady my nerves. "Well, you've got plenty of time to think about it here," I said, attempting to lighten the mood. "The storm doesn't look like it's letting up anytime soon." Elliot chuckled, glancing toward the window where snow was piling high against the glass. "Guess I'm your guest for the night, then." "You might be stuck here for the weekend," I said, half joking, half hoping. He raised an eyebrow, his smile turning playful. "Hope you don't mind the company." "Not at all," I admitted, surprised by how true it was. We spent the next hour talking about everything and nothing: our lives, our regrets, and the strange twists of fate that had brought us to this moment. Elliot had a way of making me feel seen, as if my years of isolation hadn't erased my worth. And I found myself laughing at his stories, feeling lighter than I had in years. At some point, we opened a bottle of whiskey I had been saving for a special occasion. It seemed fitting, though I hadn't realized just how much it would loosen our tongues and our inhibitions. The drinks warmed us from the inside out, and the conversation took on a more intimate tone. "You know," Elliot said, his voice lower now, his gaze steady on mine, "you're different from anyone I've ever met. In a good way." I felt my cheeks heat, and it wasn't from the whiskey. I could say the same about you. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the firelight casting a golden glow on his features. The storm outside seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the two of us in this small, warm world we had created. Elliot broke the silence, his voice almost a whisper. "Do you ever think about what it would be like to share this place with someone? To not be alone?" His question hit me harder than I expected. "All the time," I admitted, my voice barely audible. He leaned closer, his eyes searching mine. "Then maybe you don't have to be." The air between us crackled with tension, a different kind of heat rising in the room. My heart pounded as I struggled to find the right words, but before I could say anything, Elliot reached out, his hand brushing against mine. It was a small gesture, but it felt like the start of something big, something I hadn't allowed myself to hope for in years. I didn't pull away. For a moment, everything stopped. The storm outside, the crackling fire, even the sound of my own breathing. Elliot's hand on mine was so simple, so light, yet it sent a current through me that I hadn't felt in years. His touch was steady but hesitant, as if he was giving me the chance to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. "I've been alone for so long," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what it's like to let someone in anymore." Elliot's brown eyes softened, his thumb brushing lightly against my knuckles. "Then let me show you it's not so bad." The vulnerability in his voice caught me off guard, but it was comforting, like a warmth I didn't know I needed. I swallowed hard, trying to steady the pounding in my chest. We were so close now, the glow of the fire dancing in his eyes, casting shadows across his sharp features. He looked at me with a mix of curiosity and something deeper, something that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. The whiskey must have lowered my defenses, or maybe it was just the isolation and the weight of so many lonely winters. Whatever it was, I leaned in first, slowly, cautiously, as if afraid the moment might shatter. But Elliot didn't pull away. His breath mingled with mine, and then our lips met. At first, it was gentle, soft, uncertain. But the moment I felt him respond, pressing into the kiss, it was like a floodgate opening. Years of loneliness poured out of me, and I pulled him closer, needing to feel his warmth against me. Elliot's hand came up to cup the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair as he deepened the kiss. The heat between us was undeniable, spreading like fire through my chest. When we finally broke apart, our breaths came fast and shallow, and I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. "James," Elliot whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't know what's happening here, but I don't want it to stop." I looked at him, searching his face for any sign of hesitation, but there was none. Only the same need, the same hunger reflected in his gaze. "Me neither," I murmured. Without another word, Elliot stood, holding out his hand to me. I took it without question, and he guided me toward the bedroom at the back of the cabin. The storm outside roared louder as if protesting, but the world beyond my door didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was him, the warmth of his hand, the steady beat of his pulse, the promise in his eyes. Inside the small rustic bedroom, Elliot turned to face me, his gaze intense as he reached for the hem of his sweater. Slowly, he pulled it over his head, revealing his broad chest, his skin flushed from the heat of the fire and the whiskey. I stood frozen for a moment, taking him in. He was strong and solid, yet there was something incredibly gentle about him that drew me closer. He smiled faintly, stepping toward me. "Your turn." I chuckled nervously, but my hands moved to unbutton my shirt. I hadn't shared this part of myself with anyone in years. My scars, my imperfections. But Elliot didn't look at me with judgment. He looked at me like I was someone worth seeing, worth wanting. When he placed his hands on my shoulders, pulling me into him, I felt safe. What happened next was a blur of warmth, kisses and touches that ignited something I thought had long since burned out. Elliot held me like no one ever had, his lips tracing a path along my skin, his hands steady and sure. The storm outside raged on, but inside there was nothing but heat. The bed creaked beneath us as we found a rhythm, two bodies moving together as if we'd been made to fit this way. "James," Elliot whispered against my ear, his voice ragged. "You're not alone anymore. Not tonight." His words broke something in me, and I held him tighter, pressing my lips to his. We spent the night tangled together, our shared warmth chasing away the cold that had seeped into my soul after so many years alone. When I woke the next morning, the light filtering through the window was bright, almost blinding against the snow that had piled high overnight. Elliot was still beside me, his arm draped over my chest, his breathing soft and steady. For a moment, I just stared at him, afraid that if I moved, the illusion would shatter and I'd find myself alone again. But it wasn't an illusion. He was real. And for the first time in years, I woke up feeling happy. The morning light streamed in through the small window, reflecting off the blanket of snow outside and bathing the room in a pale, calming glow. I lay there, still, afraid to move. Elliot's arm was draped across my chest, his breathing steady and soft as he slept beside me. I couldn't remember the last time I woke up next to someone, let alone someone who made me feel seen. Slowly, I turned my head to look at him. His brown hair, tousled and slightly falling across his face, looked softer in the daylight. The rugged strength I noticed last night was still there, but there was something peaceful about him now, almost innocent. I smiled faintly, a strange mix of disbelief and warmth settling over me. The storm outside had stopped, but the world was still buried in white. From the window, I could see the snow piled high against the trees, so heavy it bent their branches. It would take days for the roads to clear enough for anyone to get through. A part of me knew Elliot couldn't stay forever, but for now, this moment was enough. I felt him stir beside me. His fingers grazed my chest as he shifted, stretching slightly before his eyes fluttered open. For a moment, he just stared at me, and a small smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "Good morning," he said, his voice low and husky from sleep. "Morning," I replied, feeling a warmth spread across my face. He ran a hand through his messy hair, chuckling softly. "Didn't think I'd wake up to this view." I raised an eyebrow, smirking. "The mountains or me?" "Both," he said without hesitation, his gaze lingering on mine. I swallowed hard, suddenly nervous. Last night had felt so natural, so inevitable, but now, in the light of day, I didn't know what to say. Did he regret it? Did he see this as nothing more than a one-time escape from the storm? Elliot must have noticed the hesitation on my face because he shifted closer, resting his head against his hand as he looked at me. "Hey," he said softly. "You okay?" I nodded, forcing a small smile. "Yeah, it's been a while since I've shared this place with anyone." He studied me for a moment, his eyes kind and understanding. "Me too," he admitted. "From last night. I didn't expect it, but I don't regret a single second of it." Something in my chest eased at his words, and I exhaled, my shoulders relaxing. Me neither. For a while, we just lay there, the silence between us comfortable. I could hear the faint drip of melting snow outside, a sign that the storm had truly passed. Finally, Elliot sat up, stretching his arms above his head. "Any chance there's coffee in this cabin?" he asked, grinning. I laughed, feeling more at ease. "Yeah, come on, I'll make some." We got out of bed, and I grabbed a warm sweater to pull over my head. Elliot, still shirtless, wandered into the living room, his broad back and shoulders catching the firelight that still flickered in the hearth. I busied myself in the kitchen, pouring water into the old metal coffee pot and setting it over the stove. "Your place is incredible, you know," Elliot said, walking around the cabin and looking at the shelves of books, the small framed photographs, and the worn furniture. "It's like something out of a movie. More like something out of a hermit's guide to survival," I joked, glancing back at him. He smirked, running his fingers over a pile of firewood stacked neatly by the wall. "Maybe, but it's yours. It feels safe." Safe. That word struck me in a way I didn't expect. This cabin had always been my sanctuary, but it had also been my prison. A place where I hid from the world, convincing myself I was content with solitude. But Elliot's presence made me see it differently, like it could be something more. The coffee finished brewing, and I poured 2 steaming mugs. When I turned, Elliot was standing by the window, staring out at the endless expanse of white. I handed him a cup, and he smiled gratefully before taking a sip. It's beautiful out there, he said quietly, but I can't imagine being alone in all this. I joined him by the window, my own cup warming my hands. You get used to it, or at least you think you do. He looked at me, his gaze lingering. What made you come out here, James? Why this life? I hesitated. After my parents passed, I didn't have much left in the city. I tried to fit into the world, but it always felt like I was out of place, so I came here. Figured I could start over or live simply, but the silence has a way of catching up with you, he finished softly. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. Yeah. Elliot set his coffee down and turned to face me fully. James, you don't have to carry all that alone. Last night, I felt something I haven't felt in years. Like I belonged somewhere. And I think maybe you felt it too. I met his gaze, my heart pounding. I did? He smiled, stepping closer, his hands finding my arms. Good. Because I don't want this to be the last time I see you. You'll be back? I asked, a hint of hope in my voice. He grinned, that playful light returning to his eyes. Count on it. The weekend passed in a blur of warmth and discovery. Elliot and I spent the days talking, cooking simple meals, and walking through the freshly fallen snow. At night, the fire roared in the hearth, but the real heat came from the stolen kisses and lingering touches we shared. For the first time in years, I felt alive. Elliot's laughter filled the cabin, echoing in spaces that had been silent for far too long. We fell into an easy rhythm, as if we'd known each other forever. But Sunday came too soon. The roads were clearing, and Elliot stood by the door, his bag slung over his shoulder. I'll come back, he said, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying a hint of sadness. I'll hold you to that, I replied, managing a smile. With one last kiss, he was gone, leaving behind an emptiness that wasn't as crushing as I expected. Because now, I had hope. A week later, I stood at the cabin's window, staring out at the snowy mountains. The silence was there, but it wasn't the same. My thoughts were filled with Elliot, his smile, his laugh, the way he made me feel seen. The sound of tires crunching on the snow broke my reverie. I turned to see his car pulling up the narrow path, my heart leaping in my chest. Elliot stepped out, his grin brighter than the sun reflecting off the snow. Told you I'd come back, he said, striding toward me. As I opened the door and he pulled me into his arms, I realized something. My cabin wasn't just a place of solitude anymore. It was becoming a home. Elliot kept his promise, returning again and again, and with each visit, the walls I'd built around myself crumbled a little more. The mountains were still silent, but I wasn't alone anymore. Have you ever imagined what it would be like to live isolated on a mountain, surrounded by snow, silence, and solitude? This story showed us that even in the most remote places and the most unexpected moments, love can find us. If you were in James's place, would you have opened the door? Let us know in the comments. And of course, we want to hear your thoughts on this story. Leave your rating from 1 to 10 in the comments and tell us what moved you the most. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, share with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming stories like this one. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Who knows? Maybe next time you'll find a little hope in the middle of a storm too.